Welcome back to Jail Psychologist. Today we're focusing on Indiana and the ways in which the state seems to be trying to create the least efficient criminal justice system in the country. So, what are we talking about here? Well, as of May 2026, the Indiana Department of Corrections held about 26,600 people in state prisons. IDOC across all state prisons has a capacity of 26,812. This means that the Indiana state prison system is currently operating at over 99% capacity. This figure is up from around 24,500 in 2024. I've included a graph published by IDOC which charts this increase. Strange as it may seem, the capacity problem in the state prison system actually impacts county jails on a day-to-day basis. Remember that jails house people temporarily before they're either released back to the community or, if they're convicted of a crime, are moved to the state prison system. Well, what do you think happens when the state prisons are full? The inmates convicted of crimes have to sit and wait in the county jails until a prison bed is available. This drives the jail ADP up. According to the most recent estimates, there are about 1,124 inmates in county jails across the state who are waiting to be transported to the state prison system. The reason I mention this is that local jails across the state are also operating at or near capacity. The most recent data comes from the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute. According to their December 2025 report, 34, or 1 out of every 3, jails in Indiana are operating over their recommended capacity. So what you're seeing is that because the prison system is so full, you're getting a backlog at the county level, which is contributing to county jail overcrowding as well. So here is how I want to structure this discussion. First, we'll talk about why the prison population is increasing. Then we'll talk about why this is problematic. And we'll end by talking about what the state would need to do to resolve this issue. And stay with me here because this story involves a bit of legislative tomfoolery. Okay, so first, why are Indiana prisons getting so full? The first thing to note is that the number of prisoners in the state system now, despite being at their highest level in recent years, was actually higher back in 2013. In 2013, the state had 30,000 inmates, but only about 26,000 beds. This meant that IDOC was operating at 115% their absolute maximum capacity. As a result, you had prisoners sleeping on gym floors, 3 men in cells built for 2, and all sorts of other jerry-rigged housing setups. As you can imagine, that didn't go well. The prison classification department was basically frozen and forced to mix dangerous felons with nonviolent offenders, as well as mixing rival gang members, which of course results in significant increases in fighting, stabbings, etc. So Indiana passed House Enrolled Act 1006 in 2014. If you're a nerd, you're welcome to go read the whole thing, but for our purposes, it did 2 important things. First, it banned counties from sending low-level felons, also known as level 6 felons, to state prisons. Since level 6 felonies account for about 70% of all state felony findings, this dramatically shifted the burden of housing low-level felons. The county jails would now have to hold a whole bunch of additional inmates in their custody while they serve their sentences for level 6 felonies, which range from 1 year to 2.5 years in custody. This had the impact of significantly increasing costs for county governments who historically were not responsible for housing these inmates. The other thing HEA 1006 did was increase sentences for serious offenses and mandated that convicts serve at least 75% of these sentences before they would be eligible for parole. This is an increase from 50% in the past. Setting aside the ethics and evidence or lack thereof for this policy, the practical implication is that it will take longer for inmates to work their way out of the prison system, thereby putting upward pressure on the prison ADP. The overall impact of this legislation, rather than addressing the root causes of the overpopulation problem, was to move this burden onto county governments while simultaneously creating conditions for the prison population to grow. So, fast forward to 2022. 8 years later, this legislation did exactly what we predicted it would, and caused widespread overcrowding in county jails. So, under pressure from county administrators and sheriffs, the state passed HEA 1004. In an almost complete reversal of the policies of 8 years prior, HEA 1004 said that county courts could send their convicted level 6 felons to state prisons once again. So, the courts started sending level 6 felons back to the state prisons. Over the course of a couple years, the state prisons filled up again, can no longer accept transfers from jails, and the jails are overcrowded now too. So now what do? The prisons and the jails are overcrowded, so you can't move inmates back and forth between them anymore. We'll come to this, but we need to talk about a couple other things first. One of the most obvious solutions to this problem, while certainly not the cheapest, is to build new facilities. And in fact, that has been happening. Between 2019 and 2024, Indiana county governments built new jails and expanded old jails in order to add 3,000 more jail beds statewide. So, during that time, when the jail populations were bursting at the seams, the counties were actively trying to build their way out of it. And despite all this extra building, we still have a third of county jails over their recommended capacity as of the end of 2025. Another complicating factor in all this is that in 2025, Indiana passed SB 1. In layman's terms, this was a bill aimed at cutting property taxes. The problem with that is that property taxes are the main revenue source for county governments, and county governments are the ones responsible for maintaining and staffing the jails. Dr. Larry DeBoer, an economist out of Purdue University, did a study last year on the anticipated impact of SB 1. He concluded that SB 1 will reduce the operational budgets of county governments by 25%. What this means for our purposes is that counties, who were already struggling with jail overcrowding and cannot send inmates to the prisons because they're overcrowded, are now being actively defunded so that they will not be able to afford to build additional jail beds, hire additional corrections officers, or subsidize diversion and rehabilitation efforts. We'll come back to this in a minute. Now, the state has been building additional prison space as well. As I mentioned earlier, the Indiana legislature had been aware that they were running out of prison beds for a while and that the actual prison buildings were getting old. So, in 2021, they committed to building a new Wasteful facility. This project was increased in scope in 2023 to create a larger facility with more beds at the cost of $1.2 billion with a B dollars. This facility is set to open in 2027 and will hold up to 4,200 prisoners. Now, part of the reason that the state is building this new facility is that they need to shut down the old Wasteful facility, which is like 75 years old and basically not worth the cost of renovating and repairing. This facility had 3,500 beds. So, closing the old facility and opening the new facility will add a net 700 beds for the entire state prison system. This will bring the number of IDOC beds up from 26,812 to 27,512. Assuming nothing else, if you snapped your fingers right now and added these 700 beds, IDOC would still be operating at 97% capacity. But remember that there are about 1,124 inmates in county jails right now waiting to be moved to the state prisons. If you suddenly move them into this newly created jail space, IDOC would be operating at just over 100% physical capacity. On top of this, you can't assume that the prison population is going to sit still until 2027. The prison population increased by 7.4% between 2024 and 2025, and based on figures from May of this year, it's on track to increase between 2.5% and 3% in 2026. In short, by the time the new Wasteful facility opens in 2027, every bed will be spoken for, the facility will be overcrowded, and there will still be a wait list. But that's not even the end of the bad news here. IDOC is running about 1,000 corrections officers short, which means that they may not even be able to properly staff all of the beds that they have. And it's not like this situation is improving either. They are actively bleeding staff. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Indiana is projected to lose about 8% of its corrections workforce by 2032. The reasons for this are fairly obvious. The job is hard, dangerous, you're often forced into working overtime, forced to work short-staffed, and working in poorly maintained buildings with few windows. On top of all of this, IDOC starts you at $23 an hour, which, as we have established in episode 1 of this channel, is not enough money to cover even basic expenses.
How difficult is it to attract folks to come and take this job?
$45,000 a year to start. We're competing with some fast food restaurants at starting pay.
Also, episode 9 of this channel explains why jails rather than prisons are short-staffed. The dynamics are slightly different, so check that out if you want to learn more. But the problem is basically the same in both cases. It's that compensation rates are way too low. They're hiring police officers in my county at almost double what IDOC is paying. Additionally, since 2025, state prison recruiters now have to compete with ICE. Their recruiting standards are basically identical, but the hourly pay is about 50% higher, they're giving out $50,000 signing bonuses, tuition reimbursement, and you don't have to spend all day inside of a dungeon. Remember, incentives are everything. You need to increase incentives if you want to recruit and retain more corrections officers. So, IDOC doesn't have enough beds, even with a new facility opening in 2027, and they aren't going to have enough officers to staff it anyway. So what's next? Let's talk about how this situation has been exacerbated by the state's decision to cut funding for community corrections. For those of you unfamiliar with community corrections, sometimes referred to as work release, it's basically a collection of programs designed to help divert people out of the criminal justice system and avoid sending them to prison. It's sort of an everybody wins type program because it helps offenders by allowing them to keep working, participate in treatment, and give back to their community. And it helps jails and prisons by reducing their populations. On top of all this, it helps county and state governments to save money. So, what happened? Well, in 2025, the Indiana legislature passed House Bill 1001, which was focused on the state budget generally, but one of the things it did was cut the IDOC reinvestment grants, including community corrections, for the next 2 years by $7 million. Ironically, this seems to have been done in part to help the state pay for their universal school voucher program, which, as I explained in episode 23, is simply a way to steal money from ordinary people and redistribute it to wealthy people. Now, for a lot of community corrections programs, these state grants are their most significant source of funding. So cutting this funding means that the programs will need to eliminate staff, beds, programming, or otherwise scale back their operations. This means fewer people served by community corrections, which means more people getting caught in probation or technical violations, and more people ultimately getting sent to prison. The sad thing about this is that the legislature knows all this. They know that cutting funding for community corrections is going to drive more people into prison. So why do they do it? Well, only they can tell you that. But I suspect that they won't, because this seems like a political shell game. The state's elected officials can tell voters they passed a balanced budget and protected the state's $4 billion surplus, while at the same time giving them universal school vouchers, which, ironically, the average voter isn't educated enough to see is just a reverse Robin Hood scheme. But between HEA 1006, HEA 1004, and the recent cuts to the Justice Reinvestment Grants, the entire criminal justice system has been set up for inefficiency, waste, and failure. According to the US government's own website, it's 10 times more expensive to detain someone in jail or prison than it is to use community supervision programs like community corrections, probation, and problem-solving courts. Another study found that for every $1 invested in drug diversion programs, the community saves $12. Yet another study found that every $1 invested in community reentry programs saved the community $6. Work release programs also return about $6 to the community for every $1 invested. There's a great website from the Washington State Institute for Public Policy which details studies on all sorts of diversion and reentry programs and compares costs and savings. I recommend you check it out. So, looking at this mess that Indiana created for itself, what should they do now? Well, in short, they should roll back most of the changes they've been making for the past 13 years. I've kind of already covered all these things, but I'll review briefly. First, the state should immediately reinstitute the $7 million that they cut from community corrections programs throughout the state. In fact, they should probably add another $7 million on top of that, because these programs are extremely lucrative investments from a taxpayer perspective, and the better funded they are, the more inmates they can divert out of jails and prisons. Second, the state should repeal SB 1 from 2025. The bill effectively crippled county governments at a time when a third of them have jails that are overcrowded and need to build additional space. SB 1 wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if local governments were allowed to hold referendums to keep their property taxes the way they were. However, since the legislation bars them from doing this, the bill is unequivocally bad and simply needs to be repealed. Third, the state should seriously reconsider the criminal statutes related to substance possession. For example, having the tiniest amount of cocaine, heroin, or methamphetamine, even 1 or 2 grams, is enough to get a felony possession charge and get sent to prison. So someone could have $100 worth of methamphetamine on them, and because of that $100 of narcotics, we're going to spend more than $30,000 in incarceration costs alone.
Good. Well, let's get the fuck going here. Let's get on with this and get me out, because I know you're gonna let me out anyway. It's 40 grand a year minimum to fucking keep me in here. I've seen that on TVs in jail. It's overcrowded. I didn't even do anything that bad.
Wouldn't it make more sense and be more just to simply take the drugs away and put the person in treatment, or try electronic monitoring? If there were dangerous or aggravating circumstances, then maybe a felony charge would be appropriate, but otherwise, we're spending a lot of money to punish people who, in all likelihood, are using drugs because they have a physiological addiction and or a trauma history. Now, I can already tell some people are going to roll their eyes at me. Will is a hug-a-thug type who thinks that all criminals are just misunderstood and need to be nurtured. And I'm not that. All I'm saying is, look at the economics of the situation. There was a study out of the Pew Research Institute which compared the criminal justice systems of states like Indiana, Louisiana, and Alabama, which have these very punitive felony statutes for simple drug possession, to states like Massachusetts and New York, which have less punishing statutes and more support for diversion and drug treatment programs. What they found was that states like Indiana that took the punitive approach did not reduce overdose rates, did not reduce general drug use rates, did not improve public safety, and ended up spending significantly more per capita on their criminal justice systems. All I'm trying to do here is to help ordinary people. When your state runs its criminal justice system in this sort of backward and nonsensical way, it ends up wasting tax dollars. Every tax dollar wasted in this way is a dollar that wasn't spent on your roads, schools, fire departments, hospitals, and so on. Indiana is a state that prides itself on being fiscally responsible. I've just explained how their criminal justice system is set up for inefficiency and waste. Now, I would be happy to work with any of the state's legislators to craft some evidence-based policy reforms to stop the jails and prisons from being overcrowded, improve public safety, and save tax dollars. I'll even do it for free. My email address is in the description. If you live in Indiana, reach out to your elected officials. Let them know you're concerned about overcrowding in the jails and prisons and inefficiencies in the criminal justice system. Let them know they can save money with some simple and evidence-based policy changes. Send them this video. If you live in another state, then now you know what not to do. But that's all the time we have for our session today. I'll see you next week.